hoping is more.
Here we are at MU12, site MU12, which is the edge of the Al-Khali, the edge of the great empty quarter desert of South Arabia. So we've discovered this site about 4 or 5 years ago, and this is our first opportunity to really have a look at it and see what's here, what kind of archaeological material is on the surface, and can we find it buried somewhere? Can we date any of it? That's the goal of this expedition here. So what we've got in back of me is lithic stone tools that are eroding from the surface of the landscape. And what we've observed so far is diagnostic, which is material from a time period that we can absolutely say for sure is this. And so what we found is Nubian, it's called Nubian Lavallois, which is Middle Paleolithic. So that's sometime between about 125,000 and 75,000 years ago. And then there's something older, which is a big surprise. We weren't expecting that. Something from the late Lower Paleolithic, so it could be 200,000 or even 300,000 years ago. And that's just the stuff that we're seeing on the surface. So the goal tomorrow will be to dig down a little bit and test what's in the ground, what kind of sediments are preserved beneath us, and maybe we can find something buried. All right, so here's the surface of MU12, and you can see it's a combination. We have some sand dunes here, and then there are some harder packed rocky exposures, and then there's all this grass from a recent cyclone that hit this area, and it rained all over the place. And then there are also these. This is a geode. This is hollow inside. It forms 100 kilometers, 200 kilometers to the south of us inside the rock. And then when the rivers are flowing and when the rains are pouring water over the surface of the land, they come bobbing down the river because they're hollow inside, they're crystalline inside. And so we have a landscape that's just covered in these hollow balls, these hollow rock balls. And just over here, it's about 200 meters from us, is part of this archaeological landscape. And you know it's becoming archaeological when you start seeing rocks on the surface. And not just any rocks, but chert, siliceous raw material that can be flaked like glass. So let's come on over and we'll have a look at that material. Let's see what we can find. The material here is in really poor condition, which on the surface doesn't sound good, but actually it's a great sign, because material that's in poor condition, in this case, it's white, it's desilicified, so the silica inside has been replaced by other minerals like gypsum. So it becomes softer and white. And material like that, you can tell it's been under the ground for a certain amount of time, and it's almost like a corrosive process, almost like rust forming on the outside of these pieces. So what we're looking at, you can tell the archaeological pieces when they pop up, because they're really chewed up. They almost look like sponge, and this is just from the geological processes. So let's see what we've got in this area. So here's a good example. I can tell you that this is something, but what it is, I couldn't tell you. it looks like it had been a core at a certain point. You can see really vague outlines of the scar patterns, but the arêtes, which are the ridges, are so heavily rounded, and that happens from wind abrading them, water washing over them, and then when it moves around, the edges damage, and then when it's in the ground, it becomes desilicified. So this poor little piece here has been subjected to all kinds of horrendous weathering processes over the last 100 or 200,000 years. So all we can really say at this point is it's an artifact. What exactly kind of artifact, we're not going to be able to determine. So I'm just scanning the landscape, trying to look for something that doesn't fit. So when you're doing archaeological survey, you're basically just looking for anomalies. You're looking for any rock that doesn't look like it belongs there. Which probably sounds really arcane, saying it out loud, but when you do it a lot, and when you've spent months and months or years and years surveying these landscapes, you start to pick up a sense of what's natural and what's been worked by humans. All right, there's something going on here. So there's a few really old battered flakes that look like they could be something. So if we spend a second, there may be some artifacts here that we can talk about. Wow, this stuff is in really horrible condition. So here, just looking at this little cluster of rocks, most of them are natural. And then this guy stands out because he's completely white. Now all we can see there are a couple planes along here that look like they had flake scars. And then you can see this sort of pockmarked, desilicified surface. And then there. So at some point, this was the ventral face of a flake. So this was the part of the flake that was up against the core, which is the original part of the rock that the stone tool makers would strike with a rock. So then this would flake off like that, and this flattened surface is the ventral face. This is the dorsal face. But like most of the pieces here, you really can't say what it is. It's just so heavily weathered. So we know it's a flake. We know there were people here making stone tools, but beyond that we can't say.
This is quite patinated level 1 Nubian core with typical features and with overpacing, but we have distal preparation, faceted platform, and all features of Nubian reduction, because here we can see distal preparation, typical for Nubian. Unfortunately, that distal platform, usually nosed, is missing here. So it's one thing. And what else interesting here, it is, one second, a few very patinated old cores, difficult to tell because it is more or less parallel, but very weathered surface, much more easy to see this by face. It doesn't look like handex, but it's anyway it's by face, and again with very patinated, weathered, and anyway it can be read that surface thinning, kind of this could be bifacial side scraper, but anyway it is biface, not foliate, but kind of middle Paleolithic production, which is not fixed with Nubian, so it is little different in patina and different in technology, and Nubians usually do not have. There are other samples like this with ventral thinning. It is ventral side of Debardan flake and thin it back, but cannot see good retouch. Maybe it looks like here retouch, so it is looks like going together with this. And what else? What else? What else? This is kind of convergent core, which is probably going together with this stuff. And very weathered flakes, not easy to see dorsal face, but ventral, easy to read platform, bulb of percussion, waves, so it is very old patinated material. Probably we have another sample of Nubian reduction with kind here overpacing with divergent negatives. Platform unfortunately weathered, but anyway this is more likely goes together, as well as kind of Debardan blade, which has usually accompanied preparation of Nubian cores. And some old flakes, mainly primary flakes, very weathered. At least we have here minimum 2 complexes, more old with bifacial reduction and simple convergence, some parallel cores, and Nubian Levallois, which is looks like from the point of weathering little later. Maybe it's even some lower Paleolithic stuff with base face, because before it was found some handexes here in this territory, on this site.
Good morning. So we're going to try now digging our first test pit in this basin. And this area around us is where we're finding the densest concentration of artifacts. It's still not a lot. It's still, I'd say, less than 1 artifact per square meter. But there's quite a bit. I think yesterday we picked up about 50 or 70 pieces. So we've chosen this area because it's high up at the edge of the basin. So we're standing here in this line of low sand dunes that have blown off of this dune and have worked their way toward the basin. So we are essentially standing on what would have been an ancient shoreline. So if you just use your imagination and you can see out in this direction, you would have had standing water, grasslands, a lake, maybe some marshes over there. And then here we're right at the edge. And part of the reason we know all this is because we can see what's called a strand line. You have this line of geodes that have clustered here. These geodes, these hollow balls that come floating down the river when the river's flowing, they've all been washed out here and they've ended up here. So imagine, you know, like on a beach where you see the line where the tide came up and you see all of the flotsam and jetsam that's strewn across the beach. This is the same kind of thing. So we have these. So these are giving us an indication of where the water was flowing, what was the direction, what was the extent. So we're high up, so this is about where the water lost steam and would have washed this line of geodes up around here. So we've chosen this spot as our first test pit. We don't really expect to find artifacts per se, but what we do hope to find is some stratigraphy, so some indication of past climate change as the layers have changed over time. So here we've got this evaporitic gypsum-y material on top that was once a sediment. And then beneath that, we should hope to see some sand interfingering in from the dry periods, and then maybe more of this beneath it. And ultimately, what we'd like to find is some indication of the environment that was here. When was it lakes? When was it wetlands? When was it sand dunes? So that's our goal today. It just got potentially interesting. We were digging down here in this test pit. We got to about 30 centimeters depth. We went through this layer of clay here, this hardened layer, and then went through about 25 centimeters of sand. And below that, the surface is getting hard packed again, so it seems like there's a lower layer of lake sediments that have built up. And then there was a flake at about 35 centimeters depth over here. So it's not that exciting, but just to find a buried artifact, a buried flake, it looks very much like this lower Paleolithic material that we're seeing on the surface. So to find this at depth is potentially interesting, and it's certainly makes it a lot more fun to dig. Okay, we're now finishing up our third day of exploration of this basin. So we've had 3 days to look at the surface material, to dig a few test probes, and to try to get a sense of what's going on in this basin. And I think we're starting to get some understanding of the different types of archaeology that's here. So come on and I'll show you what we found so far. This is just a representative sample. So here, in our oldest stage of artifacts, we have what are called Acheulean hand axes. And these are from a time period called the Lower Paleolithic, and that's anywhere between about 1.5 million years ago and 500,000 years ago. And unfortunately, because they're all found on the surface, we can't date them. So we don't know exactly how old they are, but we know that from sites that were found in Africa, sites that were found in Asia, we have a general idea of the time frame of these in other places where they're dated. And it's a very specific kind of technology, and it's very simple and effective. This is, you can think of it as the Swiss Army knife of the Stone Age. It's an all-purpose tool that would have been used for chopping, cutting, slicing, digging. And the way we can identify these is they have flake scars taken off here, here, and then on the obverse side from here and here. And this is why they're called bifaces, meaning they've been worked on both faces. And then here at the bottom, this is untrimmed, so this is natural, so that you've got somewhere you can hold it, that you're not going to cut your hand while you're digging. And this, we have this style here, and it's repeated over and over and over again. So here's another one. And if you look at it in cross-section, it's not flat, as we call it biconvex. It's thick. It has almost a triangular cross-section. And that tells us they're really old. They're from the oldest phase of the Acheulean period. And again, it's over and over and over again. You can see this. And you can also see the weathering, so that the edges are rounded. The material has been desilicified. It's been dissolved in the sediment. There's mechanical damage on the edges. And so this tells us, especially compared to some of the other material, that it's much older. And here, this one is my favorite. This one is really nice, nicely made. You can still see the flake scars pretty sharply here, coming in from the top, and here from the other side. And that's created this cutting edge here, this chopping edge. And then again, the base is untrimmed, so you can get your hand on it and hold it here. So that is the oldest technology, and this is lower Paleolithic from say 500,000 or 1 million years ago or something like that. And then we come over to our next time period. And for our project, this is what we're really focused on. This is from what's called the Middle Paleolithic. Middle Paleolithic is, say, about between 150,000 years ago and 50,000 years ago, roughly. And it's a much different way of making a tool. So even though this looks a little bit like what I just showed you, it looks a little bit like a biface, it's not. It's actually a core. This is not the tool. This was simply what they used to make the tool. And what they would do is they would pick up a piece of raw material, and then they would flake around the sides, they'd flake around here, and they would prepare the striking platform. And they're doing everything to prepare for one final removal, where they'd turn it like this, they'd hit it here, and then this type of piece would come off. This is the intended product. This is the tool. This is called a Levallois point, a prepared core point. So this would have been the entire goal of this process, is to create a triangular, flat, strong spear point that you can use for hunting. So it has all these telltale signs. So it has the faceted striking platform here that's been prepared. It has this Y-shaped arête. And it would have been attached onto a wooden shaft or a bone handle or something like that. It would have been used as a spear. So this is this Middle Paleolithic time period, and it is so prominent here in Oman. It is such an important stage of early human development, and it's so well represented here. So this is really the point of our study. So it's interesting to see that they are here too. They typically are everywhere we look, so they were all over this country. And then lastly, what we're finding is the most recent. And for us, this is like yesterday. So this is another core, just like I showed you, but in this case, it's a whole different type of technology. So they've picked up a piece of raw material. The ancient tool makers have picked this up, and they've hit it here, they've hit it here, they've hit it here, from all these different directions. This one is an interesting point, because they've hit it here, and they made a mistake. This is called a hinge fracture. So this means that they didn't apply enough force, or they used the wrong angle, and they ended up creating this ledge at the bottom, which makes the whole piece of raw material useless. So this, I would estimate, could be anywhere between, I don't know, say 5,000 years ago, 6,000, 7,000 years ago. It's a really crude technology. So interestingly, and it just goes to show you that you start in the lower Paleolithic with much more elaborate tools, in the Middle Paleolithic, where they're perfecting their skills. And by the time you get to this, which could be sort of late Neolithic, they're de-emphasizing stone. They're not such good flint knappers anymore. They're not such good stone tool makers. So yeah, so this we would say is relatively recent. It's yesterday, 8,000, 6,000, 5,000 years ago. So that's what we're finding here in the basin.
We have a few layers of clay. Practically it's one part, one unit, but inside of unit we can see on cross section it's accumulated many times. After that we have loose sandy sediments here, but when we go a little deeper we have more cemented sand, some small pieces of limestone. It's more cemented, it's more strong, and we can see this level there is little reddish color, and somewhere on the depth around 50 centimeters we have pieces of kind of flint. Maybe it's up to now just kind of chunks, but probably in between we may have some pieces of chips, artifacts, broken and desilicified. But anyway, it looks like promising that on the depth between 40 and 50 centimeters we can find some artifacts, because in this area, on this depth, we found one real flake. So if we will extend this direction of this, probably we will find kind of cultural level in situ, I hope.
So this here is test pit 1. This is our first test pit that we've dug in this shallow basin that we're exploring. And you can see here, we've excavated down in this part to about 80 centimeters. And over here, we're just starting, we're now at about 40 centimeters depth. And what we're finding is stratigraphy, which is, in itself is a victory. So we actually have preserved layers showing the different climate as it's changing over time. So at the top, if you look up here, we've got this top layer of clay-like, silty, really pure, well-sorted, fine-grained, silty sediment. And that's from water. So that's from standing water that's come here, and that confirms what we see with the geodes, these little hollow balls that are everywhere. So we know that there's water coming in occasionally when it rains and covering this site with this silty material. And then beneath that is this much softer sandy material. And that, we think, is from the dunes. So that's from a dry period. When the dunes are blowing, there's prevailing winds coming from this direction into the basin. So the dunes are then covering up these layers and then becoming cemented in place later on by this harder material. And then beneath that, we have another clay layer. And what's exciting for us is we have artifacts in this lower clay layer. Now, there's not a lot, and nothing that's diagnostic, nothing that we can say is from a certain time period, but simply the fact that we have buried material gives us a snapshot in time from an earlier period when the lower surface was exposed. So what we found here at about 34 centimeters depth, it's just a flake. So we have a ventral surface, a dorsal surface, a striking platform, and it was hit so hard it split in half. This is called a false burin. And it's what you typically find in the lower Paleolithic, in the middle Paleolithic. It's when they're using hard hammer percussion. So they're using a hard hammer stone to hit the core. And they hit it so hard that it splits in half. So this is, as I said, it's a non-diagnostic flake, but it tells us that we have preserved material at least at about 35 centimeters depth. So that in itself means we've learned something, and there's enormous potential for the future work here. So the next step for us is we can date this. So we can put an OSL tube in the side here, and that's called optically stimulated luminescence. So this is how we date artifacts in sandy environments. And what OSL lets us do is, without organic material, so we can't use C14, we can't use radiocarbon dating because we don't have any kind of organic carbonate material, but we have a lot of is sand. And sand can be dated using this luminescence technique by measuring the amount of stored energy in a single grain of sand. So we'll put an OSL tube in the side here, and within about 6 months we should know how old this material is. So here is this flake. What we're looking at here is the ventral surface, the flat bottom of the piece, the stomach, and this is the dorsal surface. And the dorsal surface looks to be primarily cortical, so it's a primary flake. Here's the striking platform. Here's the bulb of percussion. And what's happened with this piece is it's split in two. It's split longitudinally, and that was because they used hard hammer percussion, and they hit it so hard that it split in half. Hard hammer percussion is a typical mode of reduction in the lower and the middle Paleolithic. So hopefully we're looking at something that was deposited in the Pleistocene, in the Ice Ages, sometime between, I don't know, say 250,000 years ago and 10,000 years ago. So while we may not get the direct age of this artifact, at least we'll know when it became buried, how long ago it was buried under the ground. Okay, we're just finishing up our work here at MU12 for the week, and it's been a fairly productive and a fairly successful mission. So we've been here now 5 days, and we've been surveying the basin, surveying this immediate area where we're finding artifacts eroding from the surface, and then we've dug 4 test pits around to look for the stratigraphy and look and see what we have buried beneath the surface. So first, what we found all around this basin are these higher terraces covered in artifacts from the lower Paleolithic, from the middle Paleolithic. So this whole basin seems to be occupied for successive periods over what could be up to 1 million years. And then in this immediate area, we've collected 5 different areas, looking at different artifact concentrations, trying to understand, is there any spatial distribution, or are there artifacts concentrated in certain areas that we can then look for next season when we come back to see if we can find some more buried material. And then we walked a transect about 1 kilometer from this camp here, from the main site, into the basin to see if the artifacts petered out or continue all the way in. And we found artifacts all the way through. So we suspect that if we come back and continue excavating or continue surveying around in this basin, we're going to find more and more and more material. And it's fascinating material because it's something we've never seen before here in Ẓufār. It's lower Paleolithic. It's the earliest archaeological phase that's really well represented here. So we're beginning to get a sense that this landscape is ancient, is more ancient than even some of the sites we've seen on the Nejd Plateau. And of course, we have the Middle Paleolithic, the Nubian complex, fairly well represented here. And in our 4 test pits, we've begun to see different archaeological levels, different geological levels that indicate that this environment is changing. It's going from potentially an open savanna to a wetland environment to this sandy dune field that we see today. And in these stratigraphic sections, we're seeing the interfingering of these different layers. So if we hop on into one of these test pits, I'll give you a quick rundown of the stratigraphy. Come on. So I'm inside test pit 1. This is the first test pit we excavated. It's a 1 by 2 meter trench. And unfortunately, I'll show you this section, but it's pretty chewed up, and that's because this is where we took the OSL tubes. So we're banging these metal tubes into the wall here. So everything is falling apart a bit. So what we have at the very top is about 5 to 10 centimeters of this laminated, fine, silty material that is from standing water evaporating and bringing silt with it. So this tells us it's a wet period. So this is occasional runoff, and that goes down to about here. And then you see this really strong break, and then below that, what we tend to find is sand. So this is really is a much looser material. And this sand is coming in from the dunes. So here's wet, here's dry. And then, of course, we have these roots coming down and disturbing the whole thing. So we can see that there had been a period of stability and a period where the landscape, the bushes here are digging their roots into the section. Now, below that, at about 30 centimeters, there's this much harder cemented material. And there are some rocks in here. This is the first layer where we began to find artifacts. Now, unfortunately, I can't tell you what the artifacts are we found because they're so heavily damaged and desilicified by being in the ground that really what we have are just a bunch of flakes and chips. So we know that there are people here. We don't know how long ago, and we don't know who they were, but we know that there's an archaeological level down here in this cemented material. And then there was nothing for the next about 20 centimeters. And then down here, there's a new layer. And this is what we're trying to understand because we found some dark staining in this level. We found some evidence of roots. So it could be a paleosol, an ancient soil from a period of landscape stability. So that's going to be one of the biggest questions after we go back and analyze this section is what is this lower level? What's causing this lower level to form? And then beneath that is this much more crumbly material. And again, are we trying to determine, is this some kind of a bedrock that's been denuded, that's been essentially disintegrated over time? Or is this a lower stratigraphic level of landscape? And if so, what caused this landscape to form? So that's what we need to find out. And then at the very bottom here, it becomes extremely rocky. So we think that we're coming onto bedrock here at the bottom. But again, we're going to have to investigate a bit more to find out, are we really at the bottom or are we just at a different archaeological level? Now, in this lower material that could be an ancient soil, could be a paleosol, we found another archaeological level in the same condition as that upper material. So it's been desilicified, it's been damaged, it's been banged around. So again, we don't know what it is, but we know that there is a second lower level down here. So we put OSL tubes up here in this first archaeological level, and then another one down here in this lower archaeological level. So once we finish the analysis, we'll know when did this form? How long did it take for this to form? Under what environmental conditions did these form? And from that, we'll be able to move forward and develop a methodology for how to continue investigating this archaeological site.
And we need to understand the relationship between the Ẓufār and the Duqm area and how it was related. We need to compare the sites and we need to disentangle what's in Duqm regarding the ancient history, especially Middle Paleolithic period. We're starting here in Ẓufār because it's well known, well studied and extremely important area for our understanding, and then we will move to Duqm and we start to compare both regions and to make a kind of assessment of the importance of the Duqm itself, this kind of Paleolithic and Neolithic, these stone industries and this very, very old ancient history of Oman. And this is important for building the heritage, building the tourism, heritage tourism in Duqm, for example, but also in Ẓufār. Here, very close from here, we have a new Al-Khali festival, which is just starting up as a nice tradition. So there is a huge potential to combine and to connect and to bring to the tourism another kind of level of interesting stories in Ẓufār as well as in Duqm.